I think we'll get started. Yeah, we are going to record this session. If you don't want your image to appear in the recording, then please turn off your cameras. So good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending where you are right now. I'm Michael Rothberg, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of Kevin Bruyneel's important new book, Settler Memory: The Disavowal of Indigeneity and the Politics of Race in the United States. This is the third in our book series, which also featured work by Gil Hochberg and Mihaela Mihai. I'm grateful to my UCLA colleagues, Mishuana Goman and Hoesta Moehane, for joining us today as respondents. This event is sponsored by UCLA's Working Group in Memory Studies, and I want to thank my co-organizers in this group as well, Yair Agman, Rebecca Chai, and Sharon Zelnick. And Yair is going to be moderating and introducing the speakers in just a moment. Although we're meeting virtually, we are all located somewhere. And we want to recognize that those of us in Los Angeles are living and working on the traditional and unceded lands of the Tongva and Gabrielino peoples. The Gabrielina Tongva peoples are the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and South Channel Islands. As part of a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hanuk Vetam ancestors, Ahihirom elders, and Iu Hihinkam, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. Thanks to Kevin Bruyneel's work, today's discussion should help us to think more deeply about what it means to be implicated in settler colonialism. I first found out about Kevin from my then colleague, Jody Bird. As soon as Jody said the phrase settler memory, I knew this was work I needed to read. I then had the pleasure of meeting Kevin at a workshop at the New School, if I'm remembering correctly, and ever since then, I've been greatly anticipating this book, and it's exciting to have it in print now, and it couldn't be more timely, so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Let me now turn things over to Yair Agman, who will be moderating and introducing the speakers. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Hi, everyone, and again, thank you for all the participants. I am incredibly excited about this discussion. I also very much enjoyed your book, Professor Bruyneel, and your thinking has already made its way into my own work about the memories of settlers. So thank you for that. I also want to take this brief opportunity to recognize that in a couple of weeks, Nakba Day is going to happen in Palestine, in the still under settler colonial rule of Israel. So I just wanted to put that out there. And now to briefly introduce our speakers. Kevin Bruyneel is a professor of politics at Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts. He is of non-native settler ancestry, born and raised in Vancouver, British Columbia, the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. His first book was The Third Space of Sovereignty, the Post-Colonial Politics of U.S. Indigenous Relations. He writes and teaches in the area of political theory, critical race theory, indigenous studies, settler colonialism, U.S. politics, and collective memory. And responding to Professor Bruyneel's book would be first Mishuana Goman of the Tonawanda Band of Seneca. She is an associate professor of gender studies, the chair of American Indian Studies Interdepartmental Program, associate director of American Indian Studies Research Center, and the special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous Affairs at the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Goman is the author of Mark My Words, Native Women Mapping Our Nations, and the forthcoming Settler Aesthetics and the Spectacle of Originary Moments, Terrence Malick's The New World. Her research involves thinking through colonialism, geography, literature in ways that generate anti-colonial tools and the struggle for social justice. And also responding is Hoesta Moehane, who they are Southern Sesistas and Honenohe. They are assistant professor of English at UCLA. Their writing and teaching traces the decolonial intersection of gender, sexuality, and ecology in the indigenous literatures of North America. Our current project considers how indigenous writers respond to urban-centered biopolitics. So what we usually do is we will let Professor Bruyneel speak for roughly 15 to 20 minutes. Afterwards, Professor Goldman and Professor Mohana will offer their responses, and we will let Kevin briefly respond back, and then we will open up the discussion to questions from our audience. We ask that you already, if you have them throughout our discussion, put them in the chat, and we can then read them to the discussants as we go along. And with that, I will give it over to Professor Bruyneel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, as I do with my class when I have to be on Zoom, sound check. You got me okay? I'm not going to be the person who talks for 15 minutes on Zoom and being muted. Okay, I'm going to just sort of minimize the screen and read a little bit. I found this is better instead of looking at myself talk, which makes me anxious. This is, in fact, my office. This isn't a background screen of my messy office. So welcome to my mess in Somerville. First of all, thank you, Yair, and thanks to Michael for the invitation, and to everyone at the working group in memory studies at UCLA, to Mishana and Westa for taking the time to read and engage with my work in the midst of what is surely their very busy schedules. And really for all of you, it's the end of my semester, probably maybe you're in the middle of a quarter, but we're all busy, very busy. So just to spend time with the book is really an honor for me. I also want to take a moment to thank my series editors in the Critical Indigeneity series at the University of North Carolina Press, Jeannie O'Brien and Kehalani Kawanui. And I also want to send my love and best wishes to Kehalani as she deals with some health challenges. I wanted to be in this series, and I was honored I was able to be, because I've been influenced by Jeannie and Kehalani's work, and also they promised, and as I wasn't surprised, fulfilled the promise of guiding me and providing their constructive feedback and insight and support. So I want to thank them, because the book wouldn't be what it is without the two of them. I won't take that long, maybe 15 to 20, to sort of set out the project, what got me into it, and lay out where I'm going with it. And then I really look forward to the discussion. So what led me to this project? Let me just time it here. A couple things. One is teaching political movements, scholarly debates and legacies, my own education in US race politics. I was born and raised, as Yair said, in the West Coast of Canada. I went to Simon Fraser University, and I did my graduate education at the New School in New York, where I wrote the dissertation that became the Third Space. So I've been in the US now for 30 years. I gave in and became a citizen. And dealing with US race politics has been something I've been trying to figure out in terms of somebody who's been writing about and thinking through Indigenous people's political history and present and settler colonialism. And a big part of what I've tried to figure out in my teaching, for example, for a long time, I've been at Babson for 21 years, had been teaching classes such as Native American politics and policy, critical race theory, US politics, political theory, but I found the courses started to blend because I was constantly talking about issues in other courses, in particular courses. So US politics, I teach through a settler colonial, white supremacist racial capitalism lens. And now I teach a course called Critical Race and Indigenous Studies. That's the course I just finished up this semester. And to really think through the relationship of race and colonialism, white supremacy and settler colonialism, slavery and dispossession, labor and land issues, to name a few, that weren't constructed in a siloed fashion. There's a lot of amazing work out there and a lot of people who are working at this intersection increasingly. So I don't claim to be the first person at all. In fact, I'm building upon great work. But a lot of the really powerful research and insights and canonical tests and frameworks still built on a sort of like siloing of, this is the discussion around settler colonialism and Indigenous people's politics and land. This is a discussion around white supremacy, enslavement and labor, and not thinking through the intersection in a way that thinks about the larger meanings in place, not only historically, but also in terms of, as I'll talk about, political memory. So this is the kind of thing I've been trying to grapple with, especially in US race politics discourse in the wider political context, but also in training in terms of the major texts and frameworks we read in the study of US racial history. In political movements, I've been involved in political movements here around Black Lives Matter, migrant rights, and also I'm part of the Abolition Collective for the Abolition, the Journal of Insurgent Politics. And a lot of comrades and allies doing important work on abolitionism and decolonization, but I often felt, and I'm part of this, that we were sometimes speaking past one another. So I'm trying to figure out, especially in the US, and US race politics, how indigeneity and settler colonialism, as they say, often ends up in the background. Not totally erased, but sort of in the background of a wider discussion across the political spectrum. And I found this challenge in teaching, in my engagement with political movements, in scholarly debates, and in the wider US and beyond. The book is focused on the US, but I'd really love and be happy with a conversation that looks beyond the US. And so I came up with this analytic of settler memory, which refers to the way in which a settler society habitually reproduces memories of indigenous people's history and of settler colonial violence and dispossession, and in the same moment undercuts the political relevance, and it's really the political relevance I'm after, of this memory by disavowing the presence of indigenous people as contemporary agents and of settler colonialism as a persistent shaping force. So what I call the work of settler memory refers to a process of remembering and disavowing indigenous political agency, colonialist dispossession, and violence towards indigenous people. In the US context, one can locate settler memory at work in, well, everywhere. In sports teams, in the names of cities and towns and states like Massachusetts here, in consumer products, in military nomenclature, in memories, myths, and narratives that go across the political spectrum. Mnemonic reminders of the history of indigenous peoples and colonialism on these lands are ubiquitous everywhere, just as is everywhere the accompanying disavowal of the social and political relevance of indigenous people's politics and of settler colonialism. So I focus on the limitations of what I see the inherited race discourse in politics, political projects and imaginaries, and try to think about how refusing settler memory can open up and widen our imaginaries. And I think a lot of this, and I signal a lot of, I think, the great work that's starting me to do this, both theoretically and also politically. But I think a lot of our discourse is still shaped by this siloing and this backgrounding. And so, for example, I begin the introduction just to give you a taste, an amuse-bouche, dare I say, of it. I compare the Rachel Dolezal story and the Elizabeth Warren story. So Rachel Dolezal claims Blackness. We're in our racial categorization. She is not, she's white. She also claims, and her parents claim, that she has a bit of Native ancestry, a faint trace, but that's not part of the discussion. She's eventually made persona non grata in political circles, butt of many jokes, and we sort of generally know that story. In contrast, Elizabeth Warren has claimed Cherokee identity and a Native identity. She's been mocked, as we know, by Donald Trump, which I talk about in the book. She's also been defended by liberals, which I talk about in the book. But Warren's career, she still maintains, and even being mocked by Trump probably made her even more of a significant part of the Democratic Party. She's a senator of the state I'm in, and it will continue to be so. And so I'm not trying to pick on either of them individually, but there's a lot of system at work that has a different way in which we view these type of appropriations and claims. It's an example of what that I draw from a telling phrase from the historian Winthrop Jordan that I mentioned in the book, where he's talking about when he's writing one of his major works on the history of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, that he was planning on talking about the treatment of Black Americans and the treatment of Native Americans, but he said it was too much, and in his words, he dropped the Indians. And this is an example I see a lot, where a lot of folks are aware of the background story, or the story of the history of indigenous politics, of dispossession, of violence, of settler colonialism, but there is no framework to really have to work and rethink how we put this together with the larger story of US race politics. So instead, we just drop the Indians. So far, I think it undermines our notion of what white supremacy is, of what whiteness is. So I argue for the need to attend to white settler supremacy, specifically that of white settler masculinity. And this is not only for greater attention to indigenous people's politics, to settler colonialism, but I think it might expand our discussion around race, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, racial capitalism, and forms of solidarities I think we want to hope to build to create a better world beyond these forms of categories. So just in terms of my conceptualization, I'll ask myself two questions. And I ask myself two questions because at least I know I can answer them. Why memory and why not history? Why memory and why not history or historical studies? For me, I think facts matter, of course, but they don't speak for themselves. Memory is constitutive of collective identity and identification, commitments and intense sites of politics with. We see the fights over statues and memorials, names of universities, a lot of the critical race theory, debate and anger, positions around the 1619 Project or 1776 or 1491. This notion of certainly getting our history right, but also the power of political memory. And when challenged, the threat to political memory of people's identifications of the relationship to the past, who they are now, and where we're going forward. That's why I think these battles over statues, memorials, names really matter, because they're contesting forms of dominant political memories. So inherited narratives, habituated narratives that are reproduced in left to liberal to conservative political memories, in those political memories, are what I'm after and interested in. And why disavowal and not forgetting or amnesia? Disavowal to me concerns our commitments, it concerns our relations to others, and specifically our efforts to deflect, deny, avoid these commitments, relations, collective implication. It's the saying, yes, slavery happened, but my ancestors never owned slaves or never dispossessed indigenous people. It's ways to disavow and disconnect from what you know. Education and knowledge, which matters, of course, I'm an educator, I hope I care about it, is often internal to the self and selves. Whereas disavowal is about one's commitments or lack thereof, that reaches beyond the self to one's relationship to others, to community, to who we are both beholden to, which is a language I draw from Christina Sharp, whose work is important for my own construction of my narrative and analysis in settler memory. So that's why I focus on disavowal and memory. And then with a bit of time left, I would just want to set over the arc and purpose of the chapters and where I go with it. And then I'm really looking forward to the conversation with my interlocutors and the general community that's joined us here. So my approach is to engage in what I call, in the first three chapters, imminent and recuperative readings of key political memories, frameworks, and authors in critical race history and studies. One chapter is on Bacon's Rebellion. One chapter is on Reconstruction era, and especially pivoted around analyzing the great masterwork by W.E. Du Bois of Black Reconstruction. And another of those chapters is focused on James Baldwin. In each case, I am not rejecting in any way these powerful narratives and, of course, influential authors for me, and I think all of us or many of us, but really thinking about the ways in which intentionally, and it's usually unintentionally, settler memory is baked into some of these stories. And I think for those of us who inherit these legacies of these authors and frameworks, for us to go back and reconsider what we are missing by engaging in settler memory and leaving indigeneity and settler colonialism in the background. And just to give you a specific example, for Bacon's Rebellion is the unending, ceaseless, bottomless well of memory that we in critical race studies and race history go back to figure out where whiteness came from as a political identity. This was the moment in the 17th century when we could have had a conflict of poor versus rich in the conceptualization. Instead, we get white versus black. Instead of a black and white cross-racial class coalition, we get poor, middle class, and rich white people crossing class lines to have a coalition of whiteness against black people. And so that's the story we get in terms of the emergence of slavery and categories that is strewn across major texts that I read and incorporated into my own teaching and scholarship of major figures I mentioned in the book, who utilized Bacon's Rebellion as a key foundational point of whiteness as a political identity. And we're dealing with what white supremacy is for its political and economic, social, and cultural power. But every one of those narratives also says, the history is very clear, and they all mention it in some way, that the Bacon's Rebellion begins as an anti-indigenous violence and claims of settlers to seize indigenous territory, to turn them into property and set up settler domestic spaces. And this is not denied as a historical reality, but in terms of what Bacon's Rebellion means, the memory that comes out of it. The memory that comes out of it is about the construction of black-white binary, of whiteness as a political status, and in terms of the issue of anti-indigenous violence and land and settlerness, that's all dropped in terms of meaning making. And what I want to do is go back and draw out what's going on with that and what are the implications for now, how we think about what whiteness is. When we're talking about building class solidarities, what are the things we have to engage and encounter? And when we think about the key pivots that we're talking about in terms of contentions and exploitation, we end up focusing on labor and not land. Thus limiting what one considers when discussing the terms of class solidarity. And also with inattention to not only role of land and property, but also importantly, patriarchy, settler masculinity, and the drive of the white settler to construct and protect the settler domestic realm with violent impunity, which I end up saying continues to reproduce itself in such what I deem to be racial and settler colonial laws, such as stand your ground. So this is kind of the work that I don't say we shouldn't talk about Bacon's Rebellion, but we have to think about the legacies that are shaping the meaning making we're already presuming in it, instead of drawing out and thinking about what are the meanings of some of the things that are evidently there historically, but we're not actually engaging with how it shapes what white supremacy is for us today, moving forward when we think about what we're trying to oppose in the world we're trying to build. And just to sort of not go off, but I do similar things with Reconstruction around Du Bois's master work, where I do a sort of rereading, thinking not so much about what Du Bois did or did not do as critique, he gave us enough, but how we, all of us who have built upon and understand Reconstruction through his powerful framework, also may have absorbed the type of settler memory of seeing how land is central to that argument he makes, but the story of land, what's the story of land in terms of dispossession, turning land into property. For Indigenous people, I also talk essentially also about Black people, freed Black people in terms of land essential to the story. The story of land is missing from there, and we have to go back and think about that, especially when we're talking in our time about potentially a third Reconstruction. Part of the politics of our time, there's a movement, the Moral Mondays movement is talking about we need a third Reconstruction, which I think seems to me a project we should all be for. But if we're building on a legacy of previously failed Reconstructions that have not accounted for the role of land, indigeneity, the complicated relationship between land and labor and forms of solidarities, this Reconstruction is likely to fail like the last two. And so I think we have to engage with that political memory. And for Baldwin, as the other sort of figure I engage in, also very influential for me as for so many, he does some interesting stuff where I think he's both reproducing settler memory. There's a famous scene in the documentary I'm Not Your Negro, which Kyle Mays writes a really great piece about, in which Baldwin claims in watching old cowboy movies where Gary Cooper is the cowboy, that he's rooting for the cowboys. Baldwin is as a child, and he realizes he's the Indian. And there's moments in which he takes the position of the Indian. What he's really talking about is his experience as a young Black man with New York City cops, but he positions himself in this sort of settler mode. And so he does this a few times in his work, but also he has moments of refusing settler memory, where he's very clear about colonial, about conquest, genocide, and also talks about, for his period, the 70s, contemporary Indigenous activism, radical activism. So he's an interesting figure, which I have my students in my critical race and Indigenous studies read Baldwin for the way he's engaging with race and colonialism in his own way, sometimes really have a difficult time grappling with what to do with conquest and genocide and colonialism, especially since he's trying to still see if he can redeem the United States, but also still in many ways, and also engaging in settler memory, but also grappling with it in a difficult way. So we can read him in Indigenous studies class, not to dismiss him, of course, but actually, I think, expand what we can learn from Baldwin. And then just to move to close, the final two major chapters concern ways in which I give somewhat prescriptive readings of how to analyze the working and limitations produced by settler memory, and how to imagine refusing settler memory. And examples of, for example, sports names, which, the Cleveland name, which is now changed, the Washington name, but the Atlanta baseball team is not changed. There's still hundreds of them at the college and high school level, and still professional names. These names are, of course, racist, which is usually how they're talked about, and that's completely true. But they're also deeply colonialist practice. There's a reason why these names, this practice occurs in relationship to Indigenous peoples and not other groups who also experience racism. It's because they are, in the end, a celebration, an honoring of genocide. And I think we have to talk about the role of settler colonialism and genocide in sports names as one example of a type of appropriation. And then the other part of the chapter, because if you write a book in 2020, you have to write about Trump. It's in the political science constitution. It's on Trump, and my analysis of him as a white settler nationalist. I think talking about him as a white supremacist is not quite enough. Even his own supporters, whether it's through his campaigns, but also the insurrection and the far right, is actually racially diverse in a number of ways, hyper-masculine, but also, to me, one thing that bonds them is a clear claim of a domination of the settler colonial space, of borders, of domestic space, of the right to violence. And I think to understand Trump I think it's not the only way, but I think he needs to be understood as a white settler nationalist internally to the border, and as I talk about in the book, all the way to his even greater support for Israel against Palestine, and even some of his also predecessors who were supporters of Israel in huge ways. So I also try to reread Trump in this way, and I get involved a little more in his mocking of Elizabeth Warren, which is my less concern is his mocking of Warren, but his continual use of the Pocahontas framing as a type of white settler masculine move. And then the conclusion of the book is trying to look towards frameworks of solidarity that have existed historically between especially Black and Indigenous communities, and also writers today who are working at these intersections I'm talking about, especially Black and Indigenous feminists such as Lady Long Soldier, Christina Sharp, Leanne Simpson, and also thinking through alliances in Standing Rock and Black Lives Matter, issues around alliances around migration and borders, and also treaty commitments. So I try to provide and speak to other models that are very much out there that are doing the type of work that I'm talking about, that I, in many ways, inspired my book, but I think are seen less, seen with their meaning less, because I think settler memory within the race discourse has such a powerful sort of hegemonic force that we sometimes don't see and make meaning and see the meaning of things that are right in front of our face. And so sorry if I went on a little long there, but I'll stop there. And I really look forward to the conversation. And once again, thank you so much for this invitation.
Thank you, Professor Bruyneel. Professor Goldman?
Sikan. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invite. Kevin and I have collaborated on other things in the past, and I look very forward. I spent 2 days with his book, and it was wonderful in between reading dissertations and disc proposals, because it's that time of the year. But I was very happy to read your new work, Kevin, and I felt very pleased to kind of get some of the latter kind of, work with Trump and work with mascots, which I'm going to talk about towards the end here. But just to relate, this book examines the analytical, incomplete, and politically limited confrontation of a past that focuses primarily on what Bruyneel calls necro-indigeneity. Now, I really appreciated that term, necro-indigeneity, in terms of Mudimbe, and here I think of Mark Rifkin's work as well with Agamben, and thinking about these kind of states of exception also in relation to there, but how these tend to be geographic in nature. That is, necro-indigeneity is all over our landscapes and constructions. So all of this, according to Kevin, is a cornerstone of settler memory, which he defines very clearly in the book as not merely an erasure or amnesia about the colonial genocidal past, but rather as a settler dynamic of disavowal in the presence across a political spectrum, whether it advocates for racial liberalism or emphasizes forms of white settler freedom in the nation at the expense of Black, Indigenous land and life. Now, I want to return to that freedom later on as well and ask that perhaps you give us some more kind of intervention into how freedom is conceived in relation to settler memory. The politics of memory is a process of presence absence, a phrase that he uses quite consistently throughout the text as well. He talks about this present absence as a habituated task that we see in most of the evidence that Bruyneel examines throughout the vast geographic and temporal examples he presents as well in settler memory. As a Native woman who consistently answers the questions of, do you know of any real Indians? Or why don't you just want to be American? Or we are just honoring you? Or I had a great, great, great Indian grandparent from a tribe I can't remember. My DNA test came back. These are kind of what I see also as that habituations of settler memory and the kind of quotidian everyday examples in the life of a Native person. In fact, this habituation of thought and disavowal of genocide, treaties, forced violent inclusions, and the necropolitics of economic tyranny that our nations face is much of what I spend my days addressing as special advisor to the chancellor at UCLA. And that is just the academic politics in that sort. So the analytic of settler memory enables the ability to see these moves as the ongoing reproduction and praxis that secures, quote, white settler status, land dispossession, and the hierarchies of otherness. This is largely what is of concern in the text. Bruyneel asks us how we might move beyond, quote, faint traces in the background of white, Black binary and US racial discourse, there and not there at once. This is that absent presence. Now, he advocates doing this to relocate critical attention to how the white settler nation perpetuates itself. And that phrase, white settler nation, is, I think, very important because it doesn't just address white supremacy or the settler nation, but really he's trying to bring that together in the politics of memory. The goal here is to think about the ways racial liberalism and settler colonialism could open up the constraints positioned by a liberal colonialism. For Bruyneel, as he gets at in the last chapter, this is a matter of coalition building and providing a foundation that not only activates the politics of Indigenous race making and critical studies, but is actualizing a landscape outside white supremacy in that which is instrumental to white settler masculinity. So here, what I liked about this text was there is a definite call to action around the stakes of bringing this together. So here the work also reminded me of the habituated recourse of settler memory that claims, but he was a man of his time, but he was a man of his time. I've heard this from grade school teachers. I've heard this from students when I teach in the interracial dynamics cluster, whether we teach on slavery, Japanese internment, or any of these astounding and horrible aspects of US history. He was a man of his time. So as I tell my students, that term itself is laden with concepts of who is human and not human, with racial hierarchies and settler superiority. I am positive, I am 100% positive here, and I want to emphasize this, that Indigenous women and Black women did not consent to rape and did not consent to forced and coerced treaties that were made from after forms of starvation were conducted. So this is something I really want to make clear. I feel like that's a kind of settler memory that we see at work consistently, and we see also at work in the protest against critical race theory that we see as a religious right, very constructed movement. And for those on the call, if they want to learn more about that, the critical race theory component at UCLA Law has a great tracking about how this is actually a constructed movement. So I am positive, and I'll say that again, that these violences were not considered as a man of their time in that way, in an excused way, but that we knew what was wrong from our communities and from those standpoints. And this, our humanness is denied in this common phrase of settler memory. But we remember, in fact, in Haudenosaunee communities, we continue to call each US president Hanandagayas, or town destroyer, after George Washington, the first president, the first scorching burn campaign that was led, in fact. In fact, in this case, we still resist the settler white state in our Indigenous forms of memory practice through that very word that we hold for what the president means. But this is the subject of a different text here than the one we're examining here, which is the productive settler refusal of denying slavery and violent land dispossession. In fact, I really think a book, Indigenous Forms of Memory Practice, would be interesting in this case. So in terms of memory studies, I love that Kevin messes with the chronological weaving in and out of the present, past, and ongoing politics of what it means for the settler nation to consistently separate dispossession from racial politics. Elsewhere, I refer to this as the architecture of white supremacy in the Reconstruction era, or settlement of the West, and the possibilities set aside to retain white hierarchies at the same time. Here I'm thinking about the emptying out, for instance, of the middle of the nation, which then constructs later on certain political affiliations, etc., that isolates space geographically and then forgets or has that settler memory of not remembering, absenting at the same time, the Native nations that they exterminated through moments such as the massacre at Sand Creek and the massive massacres that were constructed in, let's say, the state of Colorado, although there's many states that had this kind of firm architectural reconstructing of geographies that were happening at the same time. So Kevin is able to thread this throughout his text by conceiving of it in terms of how the white settler nation remembers, encouraging us to ask what informs our political present and reconceptualize these, quote, layers of dispossession as they are not simply contiguous practices. They reinforce one another to constitute neither solely a white supremacist nation nor a settler nation, but rather a white settler nation. So Bruyneel's important flashpoints from the Bacon Rebellion to the contemporary January 6th event does cross a vast time period, but he brings these moments together to show how perceiving and remembering coalitions have productive absences that sustain ongoing racial settler practices. The refusal of settler memory, however, could also have productive capacities. And I'm really interested in those productive capacities. And maybe as a group, we could talk about that as well a little further. As he states in his chapter about Baldwin's theorization of, quote, a political theory of memory, in which contemporary racial injustices are the practices of the past embodied, reproduced, and lived in the present form, not merely reflections of the past. And here I do think of this in relation to various indigenous forms of practices where that past embodied, you are the dream, you are the wildest dreams of your ancestors, for instance. That's an embodied present that also is kind of a saying that is used to bolster confidence and bolster force and how we stand our ground in indigenous peoples' terms. So the stakes here are so clear. I think of the work of Linda Tuwehi-Smith, who's Maori, who states that, quote, we believe that history is also about justice, that understanding history will enlighten our decisions about the future. Wrong. History is also about power. In fact, history is mostly about power. 1,000 accounts of the truth will not alter the fact that Indigenous people are still marginal and do not possess the power to transform history into justice. So I thought about this quote by Linda Tuwehi-Smith and thinking about the call to action that Bruyneel encourages us to think about is the refusal of settler memory. In some way, that is the power to refuse that, the power to find those places where it breaks down and is fragile, and it's always fragile because part of the settler masculinity that he's talking about is a fragile settler masculinity as well. So here I think of the recent attempts also in the form of racial liberalism Bruyneel speaks to about tuition waivers in the UC system that was just passed by President Drake 2 days ago or 5 days ago. We've been kind of aware this is coming down the pipeline. But in relation to this tuition waiver for all federally recognized students from that are residents of California who have tuition waiver is part of what I'm thinking of here, right? This is kind of to repair the past or to think through the past. So there's a very much a present absence in this and the on the ground relationships that just happened. And I couldn't help but think about this as we're working through Bruyneel's text and reading it for today. It recognizes the wrongs, but that does not have the foundational structure to address the specifics of a place-based history of dispossession and genocide. So I guess one of the questions I have here for Kevin is the place-based specificity in settler memory. How do you see that working out in your text as well? So I remind us all here in the moves to continue with Linda Tuwehi-Smith. Quote, it is also about reconciling and reprioritizing what is really important about the past with what is important about the present. So as Bruyneel adds to this kind of ask, this call to action, he says, we must reimagining the meaning of the past so that they can be a source for radical and liberating interventions, listens, and possibilities. So here I think we need a generative refusal of settler memory that's so tied up in the structures, such as what we see in the case of California Indians, many who are unfederally recognized tribes, For instance, the Gabrielino Tava, whose lands UCLA sits on, will be excluded from that tuition waiver, as will the Tataviam, right? We have to recognize that. And maybe rethinking the kind of settler memory of how that there's this once absent presence. There's the presence of dispossession, but there's the absence of the action that's occurring as well. So I think about that quite extensively, and the need to reprioritize how we also can institute that political remembering. So here again, Bruyneel reminds us opening up alternative political memories could be key to actualizing new landscapes. So I also just wanted to think about this in terms of this like highly theoretical text too, to its on the ground importance. So here I turn to a more personal entry into the text. So I looked at the index before I began reading. A tip to all the undergrads out there, always look at the index and then start the reading. And I saw the mascot chapter. I sighed and in fact planned that chapter I could probably skim past pretty quickly in this overwritten territory, into territory that's, you know, American Indian Studies 101. The kids, they love to like unpack the mascot as something they can wrap their teeth around, as something they know is wrong. And it's something that they like to explore. So I was like, okay, there's been a lot written on this and we'll see where that goes. So. So I am, right now I'm going to be the Indian creeping into the text. He uses the creeping Indian and the lurking, all that. So I'm going to be the Indian creeping into the text right here. So the issues he takes up with the consumable legends that these mascots are based on is that which has frustrated me throughout this long history of resistance to mascots. Much of that resistance I have also been a part of, quite honestly. So let's talk about this free pass, as he calls it, and that is the free pass of the R word in that sense and other forms of mascot. And I ask here and throughout, what does that freedom mean? So this is kind of have this in the back of my mind. So I grew up in a town and I played multiple sports throughout my high school. And that town was called Skowhegan, and we were the Skowhegan Indians. It was recently a really violent debate and outbreak, and I'll get to that in a second. I was also a student at Dartmouth, another place that had the mascot of Indian. In fact, it was one of the aspects that were used in terms of racial liberalism to advocate for American Indian students to come to campus, Native American students, and that became kind of the foundation of one of the oldest and probably most vibrant Native American communities in educational institutions. But while we were there throughout that college place, Dartmouth is a place that exemplifies settler fragile masculinity and anti-Indianism, especially during the 1990s. And then again, I later returned as a prof where not much had changed in the alumni's beliefs that they own the consumable legacy of the Indian. In fact, many alumni were built off these myths of legends, right? Like Dartmouth is one of those places where a lot of the wealth was gained through settlement of the West and the stealing and dispossession of Indian lands. Many of the alumni in many of these Ivy League institutions have built wealth off that land, and those are the endowments that define it. So I'll just put that there in a second and think about actualizing again landscapes and what might be done there. So in this case, it was always super violent in some ways. You would go into a classroom, there'd be memorabilia, there's still the selling of memorabilia, but it became that way that Kevin talks about it, of bringing those lower class whites in conjunction with those property owning subjects of the super wealthy. It became a way that whiteness became to rule that in all of that white possessiveness when he employs the words of Eileen Moreton Robinson here. Now, in 1996 was the first time my high school actually proposed changing the mascot. I wrote a letter. I was part of the process as one of the only Indian families ever in that territory. And well, besides the Abenaki and the Norwalk Indians who had been massacred along the river spot in the 16th century, right? Other than that, contemporary, my family were some of the only ones. Not coincidentally, my family faced incredible violence in that area. I had 2 uncles murdered that was racially motivated under hate crimes in 2 different eras of time. And quite recently, within 20 years period, around that same time when they were changing the mascot, and he was brutally murdered. So all this to say that in 1996, when I wrote that, there was also death threats. I was living on campus and I was in graduate school at Stanford at the time, and there were major death threats. Now I'm bringing this personal story in here because I want us to see the grounding, the real material effect that settler memory has. That right to own manifests itself in material violences consistently. So in 2018 to 2020, there was a series of moves to remove the mascot again from Skowhegan. It was incredibly violent. The Facebook posts, the settler masculinity, the ways Indian women were talked about as the other S words, etc. It was incredibly violent and it was incredibly personal. The only 2 Native people that were saying they were Native, that were, everybody knew we were Native, the Native family in that town, were my nieces that were left to survive in that space. So when we push against also these mascots in certain spaces, they are incredibly violent spaces where there's incredible violence done to Native bodies. And so I want us to remind that, because those death threats that I received in 1996, my nieces who were in high school at the time were also incredibly aware of that violence. Now, 2 of my friends from high school who never had an awareness of what it meant to be Native, to be on the field, and there was incredible racism that happened at that time too, in that period in my life, say, quote, and this is from a news article, "We went to Skowhegan High School. We never thought about that, about the mascot when we were there. It wasn't until much later we become more aware of the issue. We wanted to get students, townspeople's different voices in the film, and we went from there." And this is a film called Fighting Indians, which I consulted on. They asked me to be a part of, but I couldn't because I didn't want my nieces to be in danger because they were in the high school at the time. So these are the real possibilities in thinking through settler memory, which I don't think substantiates itself the same across the board for everyone. And so I want us to kind of think about that and maybe unpack that a little bit and understand that materiality here as well. In fact, it doesn't manifest itself. There are certain ways that I was pinpointed in this conversation as, we weren't racist, look at Mashana, she got a PhD. It was just incredible. It's like all the racialized liberals that were on the right side of the mascot all of a sudden forgot how awful they were. And I'm not going to swear here, but I could. They were awful. So there's a particular way I think Bruyneel provides, his theorization provides that really that kind of analysis that's needed on that on the ground kind of violence that Native people experience in these particular moments. So to return to the free press, I believe that Kevin upsets these concepts of freedom, which reverberated throughout most of the debate, even with the mascot Indians. It's our free right to wear an Indian t-shirt. It's our free right to do this, right? And also coincidentally, that became a huge Trump era, huge gun owning. You know, that was part of the reason in northern rural Maine, you can't take people's guns away or even threaten. And that was a rhetoric that was used. So within that, we see that that those debates coming through from this small town incidents I'm talking about in northern Maine to what Bruyneel brings up in terms of Virginia being afraid of Indians and having being afraid of Indians to advocate for guns and whiteness and settler domesticity, and the ability of the elites to use that to kind of reconcile, to kind of bring together forms of a white possessive instead of doing what is right. So to be clear, and I'm curious here, this is not my freedom dream, and I would prefer to have the freedom dreams of Robin Kelly than the freedom dreams or the freedom of the settler state anytime. And I want us to think about that. So again, I relate this because I want us to remember that there is a material reality, a material violence, and an ongoing violence that's at stake in these matters, at stake in the land that has been redefined as settler white properties of possession. There are numerous land grabs going on even as we speak. And so I bring this up. And I also, because I promised a little irreverence in this, I want to remind us all that decolonization is not hot sauce. It's not something to put on everything. And we must be anti-colonial in our efforts always to make freedom dreams. And yes, I just slipped into a little bit of Maine accent there. Thank you, Yahweh.
Thank you so much, Professor Goldman, for that powerful and personal response. Professor Mohana, please. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I just want to double check. Am I audible as well? Okay, wonderful. So hello, everyone, and thank you to the Memory Studies Working Group for the invitation. I'm delighted to be able to connect with you all today. In Settler Memory, Kevin Bruyneel traces the politics and poetics of settler colonial memory as a structure of racial feeling that is connected to settler whiteness and its violent material forms of possession and entitlement, effectively theorizing how US settler imperialism operates in North America and beyond. Bruyneel argues that whiteness has been instrumentally decoupled from notions of both the settler and colonialism, that indigeneity is perniciously disavowed in the normative narrations of race and politics in the US, and that anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence are often conceptualized and analyzed apart from Indigenous dispossession and genocide in so-called leftist politics and anti-racist scholarship. Bruyneel draws on important conversations taking place in critical Indigenous studies and Black studies and puts them into a productive conversation about the possibilities and shape of decolonization and forms of abolition, illustrating why abolition and decolonization must be thought together as part of an anti-colonial future beyond US settler empire. If, as Bruyneel writes, drawing on the work of the late Patrick Wolfe, quote, race is colonialism speaking, then Bruyneel continues, quote, what colonialism is saying through race in the US political context is nothing to see here, move along everyone. Bruyneel notes that, quote, it is fitting that these words sound like something the police would say, end quote, as the book traces these structures of violence from the control and subordination of racialized African, Black, and Indigenous socialities from the 18th century to the present. Bruyneel, for instance, insightfully disrupts normative narrations of foundational and often mythological moments in US histories of race, such as Bacon's Rebellion. He illustrates how stories of failed cross-racial coalitions circulate and elide how the genocide of Indigenous peoples in quests for territory served as a foundational catalyst for the event. By reading For the Structures of Settler Memory surrounding the rebellion, Bruyneel excavates how assumptions about Indigenous lands as always already property and the potential possessions of settling white subjects undergird notions of enfranchisement and redress within the settler political economy. Following these lines of violence and turning to the era of Reconstruction, Bruyneel examines how historical and contemporary constructions of whiteness are formed through anti-indigeneity as much as they are formed through anti-Blackness. Reading Du Bois' conceptualization of land and the material consequences of the Homestead Act, Sherman's Field Order No. 15, and Grant's peace policy, to name but a few formations, Bruyneel contends that transforming Indigenous homelands into state-sanctioned private property and intergenerational wealth for white socialities through genocide and dispossession normalizes patriarchal settler relations to possession while foreclosing alternative Black and Indigenous relations with land. Drawing on Mshwana Goman's formulation of land as a meaning-making process, Bruyneel thoughtfully speculates about the alternative collectivities and relationalities that could have taken shape in the 19th century if Black and Indigenous peoples were able to form relationships to land that were unmediated by empire. Throughout the book, Bruyneel also traces how the violent imposition and maintenance of heteropatriarchal structures and policies vis-a-vis what Scott Loria Morganson calls settler sexualities and what Aileen Morton Robinson calls patriarchal white sovereignty shape the racialization of Black, Indigenous, white, and white socialities. These interlocking logics also shape what can be expressed discursively through the grammars of race in the United States, as evidenced by Bruyneel's readings of James Baldwin's speeches and writing. Charting the violence movements of settler and often heteromasculine formations, Bruyneel demonstrates how gendered racializations, the policing of the domestic sphere, and state and non-state forms of terror cohere around white settler nationalism. Importantly, he connects these embodied forms of violence and entitlements to the state stand your ground laws, as well as Trumpist politics of white masculinist settler imperialism. However, it is in art and anti-colonial coalitional politics that Bruyneel finds the most powerful and generative refusals of settler memory. Bruyneel turns to Oglala Lakota writer Layli Longsoldier's conceptions of unholding and her powerful reworkings of the imperialist language of whereas, as well as the Black Studies scholar Christina Sharp's theory of wake work. For Bruyneel, both Longsoldier and Sharp offer powerful praxes and poetics for resisting the violent present of settler memory. Bruyneel reads contemporary anti-colonial movements and expressions of solidarity found in No DAPL, Black Lives Matter, activism surrounding murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and the state-sanctioned violence of the water in Flint, Michigan, as vital instances of Black and Indigenous people collectively resisting the practices and necropolitical structures that are supported by settler memory. Examining these enactments of settler memory throughout the book reveals that what is needed is not another reconstruction of the US settler empire through what Michi-Saagiig Nishinabeg scholar and writer Leanne Simpson has called the creation of a gentler, kinder patriarchy, but instead an abolition of the structures of dispossession, genocide, gendercide, enslavement and its afterlives, settler capitalism, settler property, and in its place, the blossoming of new and emergent forms of collectivity. In imagining these kinds of anti-colonial wake work, I'm reminded of the poet and scholar Fahima Ife's book, Maroon Choreography, which was also published last year. In their collection, Ife meditates on the spaces, movements, and possibilities of refusal through, quote, a feral spirit of study, waywardness, tarrying, ritual, practice, rehearsal, shoal, ceremony, and wake, end quote. Writing against settler memory, Ife addresses how Blackness and indigeneity are created by white settler supremacy and heteropatriarchy, while also making space for anti-colonial futures through movement. Quote, they eat names, ethnocentric, gender, biological sexisms, land. They ate names, Bambara and Choctaw. Etymology made them design, made them Black Indian and Maroon, and made the names they did not call themselves, names not taken, but given. Their lungs grow into something other than windpipe, cosmic flute, when they dance, end quote. Artists like Ife make space for Black and Indigenous futures beyond empire and settler memory, imagining how these futures might be danced and lived differently through anti-colonial collectivities. And what's really striking to me is the array of texts that Bruyneel moves through and really calling upon all these voices that are collectively thinking through these problems and impasses produced by empire, where we have just more and more resistant, beautiful forms of art and thinking coming about. And last year, with the tumult and the continued tumult of this year and the past few years, it's just very striking and moving to me that both Bruyneel's work kind of cataloging and unpacking and disentangling settler memory is kind of part of this wave of thought, art, and praxis taking shape. This kind of poetic refusal of kind of collectivity and resistance, I think is very much part of what Bruyneel's kind of leaving us with as he closes the book. And I look forward to kind of thinking about those futures of refusal together with Mishwana and Kevin. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohana. Professor Bruyneel, do you want to respond briefly before we get to our Q&A?
Sure. First of all, thank you for this, Mishwana Huska. This was really vibrant and great. And as I said, I'm just honored that you took the time to really engage with the book so thoughtfully. So I'll just a few things. I actually want to begin with Huska's notion of poetic refusal. I think for me, I have no real knowledge base to speak about poetry at all. But for me, as somebody who's so stuck in my academic world of types of monographs, poetry is, in the last, I think, 5 to 10 years of my life, poetry and fiction is where I turn to sort of break out of the way in which I'm thinking about systems and structures, and then suddenly provides another language and another opening. And not that I wouldn't have come across Lady Longsoldier's work or others, but for me, suddenly I was like, these are productive interlocutor texts for what I'm doing. And I think for me, poetry and art forms are not outside politics. I think they're opening up another way to think about the language of what counts as politics and counts as our relations of community. So I noted maroon choreography for a text that I now want to definitely be engaging with. So I'm glad that sort of you ended on that, because I think it was part of, one is I turned to political movements that are going on, organizations that I think are trying to work and refuse settler memory, but also in dealing with, as a teacher, dealing with students who are a little intimidated in terms of going towards political movements. I found that texts such as Long Soldiers and others are a way to sort of provide them an entry point for breaking out of a lot of their inherited legacies and hegemonic understandings of how race, how gender, how colonialism does and does not work. And so for me, I probably pulled out some other poetic work that I was going to incorporate, because you eventually got to edit this thing down. But thank you for that reference and that rereading of the text. I do want to, just because I don't want to take up too much of the time, I do want to talk a little bit about Mishana's question about freedom. Because I think for me, when I talked about, I teach political theory, US politics, all these different freaking courses. There's like 2 political scientists in our whole thing, so we cover everything. We have like a Noah's Ark of liberal arts at Babson College. And when I would teach about freedom and political thought, I would teach Isaiah Berlin's notions of like negative freedom, freedom from interference, or positive freedom, freedom to do things. And I often found myself when I was talking about the problems with negative liberty, notion of negative liberty, which is freedom from, stay out of my space, leave me alone, right? These are my boundaries. I would talk about the imposition of property rules, of domestic realms, of ownership over bodies and people, and as part of the origins of a type of freedom that we now see with gun rights or with property claims. And an example that's not in the book because the book was already out, but Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Kyle Rittenhouse he claims he's defending property. And I'm not a racist. I'm just defending a civil community against this chaotic movement called Black Lives Matter, but I'm not a racist. I don't know what's going on in his head, but the very claim to focusing on property and domestic space and civil order is a classic sort of narrative used by white settler supremacists historically, that it's not about race and clothes, I'm just defending the space. Well, then how is the space produced and defended? Where does it come from? Who are the people within that space who are themselves experiencing domestic oppression, right? And so I think this notion of freedom, I think, is central to part of it, because when trying to engage with whether it's coalitions or solidarities or critiques, so much of what counts as freedom, mobilizing, empowering freedom in the US context, is a white settler notion of freedom, of freedom defined by non-interference in my space, my community, my domain. It is built upon histories of settler colonial violence, white supremacy, patriarchy, of defining belonging and community, and what it means to invoke freedom that is limiting. I mean, one of the things that I find powerfully about James Baldwin, and why I love going back to him, is he talks about in his letter to his nephew James that white people aren't free. that we will never be free until white people are free. And I ask my students, this doesn't make any sense. Why aren't white people free? And he's talking about this limited notion of freedom that's about my boundaries, my constraint, what I have and what others are threatening to take from me. And until we get beyond that, his argument is, until white people get beyond that, we're not getting anywhere. And I think part of that, although I don't center that debate about freedom, certainly in the back or the near front of my mind is this issue of how I think settler memory collapses and narrows fundamental concepts such as freedom, democracy, aid for one another, caring in terms of and also our relationship to security of one another and family and community. And so I think that I really appreciate the question about freedom, because I think that's something I'm still working through. But certainly I see in which way in which settler memory and white settler colonialism has narrowed in a way that's really fundamental to, I think, white settler majorities, to settlers, their understanding of what it means for themselves to be free. And then so claims about, so to go to the sports name one. I mean, the sports name one, the mascot one, does get, I mean, in ways that, Mishana, your narrative is horrifying, again, because there's so much investment of white settlers in the notion of what a mascot challenges is the very notion of the settler self, which is settler masculine self, which is unstable. And what part of it is the sense that they are committed to not being racist in a racially liberal way. A big part of my book is a critique of racial liberalism. And engaging with folks who are defending these names, a real belief that they are honoring Indigenous people, that they are really doing this as a form of possession, right? A form of possession and claiming to those identities. And so the challenge to them is suddenly a challenge to their very understanding and their political memory of what they are doing here, their sense of this relationship to place, their sense of freedom in this place and belonging. And I think that's when it becomes that sort of instability of settler masculinity gets exposed and challenged. And so it's not just a name anymore. It's not just a name on a baseball hat. It's fundamental to their sense of self. And that's where I think the anger, and I just wrote a piece for Huffington Post, a short op-ed saying that the problem with the Atlanta baseball team name is not just racism, it's genocide. And then my brother said, don't look at the comment section, because it's all coming in with notions of absolute vitriol of not understanding why this is an issue. And I think this is where settler memory blocks a sense of being able to think in a larger expanse of why is one group of people, Indigenous people, the subject to this particular appropriation over and over again? And why are settlers so invested in it? And I think that sort of violence is something that the mascot name, and I tell my students, can seem like it's a benign thing, but actually it speaks to and is produced by the roots of deep genocidal violence. And until we deal with that directly, we can't just talk about it as offensive or discriminatory. It is that too, but that's the racial liberalism perspective, where we just move it. The Cleveland example is the Cleveland team name, which is now the Guardians. You can still buy that. You can still buy that team name's, the mascot. You can still buy that if you really want to. It's still being sold for fans who want it. It's racist and offensive, but it's much more than that. And it's getting to that next level that I think is provoking white settlers and their instability. But then it pushes back because their very sense of identity is so produced through these particular names. And so what seems like maybe a minor matter becomes a fundamental matter of personal and collective identity. So I'll stop there. And obviously the comments have really provoked, in a good way, me to think through more thoroughly the project. But thank you very much, both of you. This is really wonderful.
We have a couple of questions already. So Avi Chomsky writes, can you say anything about how your analysis can help us think about US foreign as well as domestic policies and realities?
Yes, in the sense that, well, I'll say yes, but, because I don't want to claim to be an expert on US foreign policy, but one of the ways I try to make the connection in the Trump chapter is to connect US settler colonialism to imperialism abroad, to support of settler colonial regimes such as that of Israel. And that, and others, like there's many of the folks who have written of this. Greg Grandin's book is there's a lot of work out there that's getting to the relation to the US settler imperialism and the larger global imperialism. I do think that part of it is the critique of US imperialism Broad needs to be engaged for itself, but I think we also need to begin here in terms of how the sources of it is right here in terms of US imperialism and settler colonialism on these lands. And I think if we detach, which happens a lot, and this is where I see my engagements with anti-war activists that I've been allied with, to separate out what's going on in the US in terms of US imperialism here from that abroad. So to critique of what happened, the invasion of Iraq, that seems separated from forms of colonialism here. And we need to make these connections here to be then hopefully provide a solidarity to then be critiquing how this very imperative of colonial domination, dispossession, violence is carried forward abroad from the late 19th century on to today. So that would be I think there's very clear connections. And my view is to try to continually, as so many people on the Zoom call are doing, critique the discourse and the practices here as part of challenging the regime, settler colonial regime here, which carries on those same logics abroad. It's a tough one, and I think there's smarter people than me, many, who are trying to engage with it. But I think there absolutely is a fundamental connection.
Thank you. Helen writes, I appreciate how disavowal holds such critical weight in this work. It seems to me that in book form, you deliberately situate your framework in opposition to forgetting and amnesia. You also engage colonial unknowing, and the authors there also think against omission and amnesia. I'm curious whether another juxtaposition informed your thinking, that of disavowal versus denial. If it didn't, then why might disavowal do more strategic work for you than denial? You discussed this briefly in your presentation, but would love to hear more.
Sorry, I was just I'm getting caught in reading the chat. Okay, disavow. I mean, I deem denial to be one of the component practices of disavowal, and I think I'm setting up disavowal as a larger, both psychological, political, social, cultural type of politics of not engaging in full acknowledgement of practices. So I deem to be denial, I think, to be a more specific type of practice of disavowal, whereas disavowal, I think, has many forms it takes. So disavowal me is kind of the umbrella, and there's many ways in which this is engaged with, and denial is one of them. So that's how I don't think it's disavowal versus denial. It's in the denial is one component part of disavowal, but I think disavowal takes many different forms, and I think denial is one of them. That's off the top of my head, and my head is thinning with hair, so I might not quite have it right. But I just noticed that, Mishana, did you want to take on the acknowledgement question you mentioned? I just saw
sure. The question is, could you talk about land acknowledgements in relation to the research, Lee and Atone, on land grab universities? Aren't acknowledgements that do not acknowledge that land grants on which university stands are never freely given? Do you have suggestions on how they could go beyond as form of restitution or empowerment of Native memory? So first, I want to say I have a series of podcasts coming out called Land Introductions, and these land introductions about the UC, and so they're specifically place-based. Now, at UCLA, I worked in conjunction over a year at the bequest of the Gabrielino Tonfa people. I worked on the land acknowledgement. So while there's a lot of critiques about land acknowledgement, do people actually ask the people whose land they're on what they want? Right? I asked what they want. I held a tribal listening session, etc. They wanted a land acknowledgement because they were tired of being erased in the landscape of Los Angeles. And the land acknowledgement, to be quite honest, many people use UCLA's because I did do the work in conjunction with different tribal elders and cultural leaders. It did get used. It did get used at the Academy Awards. It did get used in various other places because I worked with those tribal cultural leaders to begin with. They all have their own little tweaks on it because not everybody agreed. But in that in that land acknowledgement, they had very real place-based concerns. So there's ways to do that. So for those wondering about this, you can look at CSU San Marcos has a wonderful land acknowledgement toolkit to how to create a meaningful one. Now, in terms of going beyond, this is part of where the tuition waiver that I just talked about at the UC President's Office, that's kind of where it comes from. Although again, there's a separate fund. Prop 209 limits what can be done because federally recognized tribes are political entities, as Kevin makes clear in his book. Makes Prop 209 doesn't matter in that case. But for unfederally recognized tribes, which are in the highest real estate markets in which UC Berkeley, UCLA, UCI, Kumei, I recognize. For them, it makes it, there's a separate sets of fund. So if people are really concerned, they have to, I would watch the admissions, particularly faculty within the university that you're in, watch and see if the admissions dial moves to admitting more students. And that doesn't mean just admitting, but bringing people to campus, right? Because in the past, the thing has been, oh, we can't compete with the Ivies because of the money, right? So this should move the needle. If it doesn't, we should be vigilant. The other thing is supporting the land rent acknowledgement, supporting on campus. There's many places on campus where we're instituting traditional caretaking practices all across campus at UCLA. There's particular ways university could do that, make the campus open and to the local Native people. That's also gets at the land and settler memory aspect. But there's certain direct initiatives that can be done. But first of all, you have to ask the people whose land you're on what they want, what they see as that future. Because if you don't ask them, you're not really decolonizing. You're just giving them, you're just doing what you think is best. So with that, I'll say that. I like to call them land introductions, and I do that for a specific reason, because in Haudenosaunee culture, we had the words that come before all else, the Thanksgiving address, that puts you in relationship to everybody, to people. It's an ongoing practice, though. It's not something that happens once. You have to have that ongoing practice of that. And that's what happens in an introduction, right? You meet somebody and you follow up on that meeting. So that's kind of how it happened at UCLA. But I also encourage, I think people are big to jump on the anti-land acknowledgement without asking the people whose land they're on what they want. So that's my answer to that.
Wow. Thank you, Mashana. If I can add just one thing to that, because I do a project with my students, and one of the things they do is we have a Google Doc and we start to construct a land acknowledgement, and part of it is through research of the nations in the area and the history, so they can understand. And we had this semester, who's actually a Babson grad, Kyle White from the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, visit our campus and our class, and the students asked about this, and Kyle said his view of it is that the first thing to do for non-natives is to do your homework. Do your homework before you come talk to anybody. Like, go do your research, understand what you're talking about, and then communicate with Indigenous communities in your area. Because for him, the first step was, this is an opportunity for non-native people to learn something and to engage in a way that's practical and not a rote notion of a land acknowledgement. And for my students, what they end up doing is actually a version of, not as detailed, certainly as Mashana just said, but of learning and communicating with local nations in the New England area, and also finding out what's been going on with the Mashpee Wampanoag, which was a lot was going on during the Trump administration beyond. And therefore we made the land acknowledgement, or trying to construct one that's a fluid document that changes from year to year, instead of this one that sometimes is set in, that becomes the acknowledgement that's referred to. But the first part we engage with, and I thought that Kyle sort of set it off, is go do your own homework before you're expecting us to do the work for you. And then come back and say, now that you know this history going on, then we'll talk about next steps. So that's another way in which I've tried to think about, and not dismissing land acknowledgements, but thinking about how they can be something that can provide a way in which non-native people can engage in refusing settler memory, to think about contemporary forms of, to get to my earlier point, of political commitments. What does a land acknowledgement commit you to?
because you already looked at the chat and peeked ahead, is there a particular question you might want to answer, or should I just go by order?
You can, dealer's choice.
So I'll just go by order to be fair. Savannah writes, she's curious about the focus on settler masculinity, and she's thinking about the ways white femininity and white settler domesticity has been so central to land dispossession, but also theft of Black and Indigenous children, and the list goes on. Curious about how you're engaging with Black and Native feminist work on this.
Thank you. I mean, in terms of like white settler masculinity, I invoke and bring in Margaret Jacobs' work and talking about forms of white femininity. So it's not to say this is all on white men, but white women also supporting, white settler women supporting a white masculine regime. And for me, and so that's and part of the many examples I try to fluent. One is the history of the violence and the kidnapping of boarding schools as part of this very form of white settler masculinity, of genocidal assimilation. And so that is part of the narrative that I try to incorporate as an example of it. That's very much tied into forms of white settler femininity that's supporting a white masculine regime. And for me, in terms of the question about Black and Indigenous feminisms, I don't know how the book exists without Black Indigenous feminisms. I mean, you can never, incorporate all the different influences that you have in a book. But Mishana herself, Kim Tallbear, Sadia Hartman, there's lots, we talk about Christina Sharp. In terms of the framing, it's the critiques, the histories, the frameworks that are tied to a lot of other authors and scholars and poets. But what I hope with the book, which is not a plan in terms of who I'm going to talk about, but in terms of how I got myself to a position to be able to develop the narrative and think about who are the writers, the thinkers who are pushing me in this direction, that I'm trying to synthesize and work through the particular moments that I think are sort of contained narratives, such as around Bacon's Rebellion and Reconstruction. It's a significant work of Indigenous and Black feminists who are theorizing, working through, and engaging, whether it's critiques of Du Bois and his own patriarchal sort of systems and views. And also Audre Lorde in Conversation and Connection and calling out James Baldwin's own presumptions. So I think that's part of a conversation. Lee Maracle is very important for the beginning and shaping and thinking of a lot of the ways around memory. So for me, I hope that the work reflects the way I've learned from and honor and try to incorporate in the analysis Black and Indigenous feminisms. I think there's always ways in which it can be more expansive, but absolutely fundamental to me.
I want to be mindful of time. We're almost out of time. So maybe one more question or two. Naomi writes, what do you see as emerging possibilities or historical examples for Black and Indigenous solidarity against the background of Black civil rights having often been framed as a claim to full citizenship in a settler colonial state? And she's thinking about a paper by Christy Dotson bringing a Black feminist approach to this issue.
I think there's a great deal of, I think part of it, it's a great question. One of the reasons I love engaging with Baldwin, because Baldwin goes back and forth between whether he thinks whether he thinks the US state can be redeemed or not. And he knows it's a violent, burning nation, but then he sees like, I helped build it metaphorically and literally. And I think that Black Indigenous solidarity is, as I say in the book, and Cedric Robinson lays this out in one of his books, it's contingent and flows over time based upon responding to violence in maroon communities. And I think that because of settler memory and the ways, as I tell my students, racialization teaches us to see what we're supposed to see and not see what it doesn't want us to see. And I think that settler memory, in terms of engaging with history, we often, the larger we of whoever we are, don't see actually forms of solidarity that have been there historically, fighting for alternatives to the settler colonial state. There are certainly examples of forms of assimilationist discourse in Black civil rights discourse, and I think that's what Baldwin's pushing back on. But part of the way I try to end the book is focusing on what I see forms of solidarity and imaginaries that are refusing forms of assimilation to the settler colonial state. Imagining, I mean, I've been involved in abolitionist sort of theorizing through the collective, and abolitionism and decolonization should be about also world building. What's this next world supposed to look like? And that's a challenge, and that's not easy. But that's not the settler state. That's not the white. We have to think beyond it. We have to both be advocating, critiquing, and thinking what this world's going to look like. And I think then the tensions also emerge in terms of this question of what is the role and meaning of land. This is something that in terms of this Indigenous Black relationship, and generally, I think radical politics, whether it's this language of the commons and people who want to radically critique and are radical anti-capitalists, I think there's a difficulty in getting this conversation about the story and meaning of land. And I think that's also part of what I'm trying to push forward that has to be engaged. And so I think there's historical examples of contingent collaboration. I think there are contemporary examples of solidarity of Black and Indigenous thinkers and activists who, from my reading, are really pushing against a framework of freedom that's defined by and through the settler colonial state and its hegemonic parameters of what freedom is, and what democracy is, and what equality is. It's tough, but that's hopefully that's the direction I hope I try to signal.
This feels like this feels like a good place to stop with solidarity. And I want to be mindful of it. So I want to thank again Professor Bruyneel for this wonderful talk, and for our discussant, Professor Goldman and Professor Mohana, for their really thoughtful and provocative responses, and for everyone for attending and the beautiful questions that we got. We will post this recording online, I think. We have to talk about this. But otherwise, again, thank you so much. And we'll stop the recording here. If you want to stay,